we quote a lot of people from the church, and over the years, sometimes people say with things like that, they say, well, back then the only place you could get an education was basically through church schools. So really, maybe these were just educated people who needed to be able to attend and under the veil of pretending to believe the church things because they needed a good education. Like sometimes you hear the charge to say, well, in certain parts of the poorer third world, the seminaries are full of all of these people, not because they're driven by faith, but because it's the only way they can get a good education and maybe get out of the life they're living. What do you think about that kind of a charge?
Well, there may be some truth to that for sure. But in the case of the people I was just talking about, right, Nicholas Copernicus or, Gregor Mendel, I mean, clearly their faith, Father Georges Lemaitre, right, clearly their faith is not just, a happenstance, right? They have faith because they wanted to have faith. And by the way, it's not just these priests, right, who go in there, I mean, Georges Lemaitre could have done anything, right? I mean, once you have a PhD from incredible universities in cosmology, you don't have to be a priest. You don't have to stick around. World War I hero could have done anything he wanted. In fact, all these guys could have done anything they want. But if you start looking at the history of science, right? If you look at Kepler, wow, he was truly a religious believer. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a Catholic, but obviously an incredibly important. Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, right? He stops writing after the Principia Mathematica, where he talks about a system to explain the entire universe vis-a-vis the laws of gravitation and matter. And of course he stops in to do what for the rest of his life? To study theology and scripture. Newton was absolutely a believer, right? And not only a believer, but a strong believer. We know that Albert Einstein himself, he was not a believer in a personal God, but he certainly believed, as he proclaimed, that there was, a super intellect, right? A kind of a mind that infused itself, right? And he said, I can't get beyond this feeling that, this sense that there is a super, kind of intellect, this mind which is operative in everything in the rationality of the universe itself. Sounds like God to me. And of course, if you take a look at the three other really truly great physicists and even mathematicians, I mean, Max Planck, right, a clear believer in God, a religious person, or he's the person who developed quantum mechanics, right? And of course, I'm sure you've all heard of Erwin Schrödinger and the wave equations. I'm sure you've heard of Werner Heisenberg, right? I mean, Heisenberg, who is the uncertainty principle, right? And a variety of other really important discoveries. Absolutely believers not only in God, the intellect of vis-a-vis Einstein, but God, the personal God who relates to us. I mean, similarly, Gödel, right, Kurt Gödel, who wrote that great proof, right? The Gödel theorem, right? A fine mathematician, very much a believer in God. Sir Arthur Eddington, right? The great astronomer and physicist, wrote that book, right? The Nature of the Physical World, fusing quantum mechanics with relativity theory. And what does he put at the end of his book? A defense of mysticism. I kid you not. It's called A Defense of Mysticism. I just paraphrase, the end of the thing. He says, look, there are things of the spirit, there are things of art, there are things of beauty, right, that, make the mind move almost, as it were, toward the mystical, toward the beyond, right? But he then says, science cannot challenge that warrant either, because science proceeds from an awareness, a beyondness, right, an intelligibility that draws the scientist to itself, right? So he's almost saying that there's this intuition embedded within the world and in the human spirit that is drawing the scientist towards scientific discovery. In the end, said Eddington, the great mathematical astronomer, right, in the end, he says, the light beckons ahead and the purpose surging within our nature responds. He calls it God. So, I mean, these are the I mean, we're not talking about mincemeat minds here. We're talking about the best intellects that science has seen, and they're obviously believers. Einstein, not in a personal God, but with respect to the other physicists I've mentioned and mathematicians I mentioned, all believers in a personal God.